Happening overnight, Roy Lee Ward was executed by lethal injection at the state prison in Michigan City.
And the Department of Correction tells us that he was pronounced dead at 1:33 this morning.
At 12:33 a.m. this morning, Friday, October 10th, 2025, after 8,157 days on death row, a lethal injection of pentobarbital began to flow into the veins of Roy Lee Ward. Moments later, he was pronounced dead. For the state of Indiana, it was the final act of a justice process that spanned nearly a quarter century. But, in the sterile silence of the execution chamber, a final mystery was born. Roy Lee Ward's last chance to speak, to explain, to show remorse, was met with silence. His final words were written on a piece of paper held by another man, a statement no one was allowed to hear in that room. What he said in that silent message would be the last haunting chapter of a story that began with a knock on a door on a quiet summer afternoon. Dale, Indiana. 2001, a town of just 1,800 people, nestled in the rolling hills of Spencer County. It was a place where doors were often left unlocked, and the hum of cicadas was the loudest sound on a July evening. In this town lived the Payne family, and their daughter, 15-year-old Stacy Payne, was the embodiment of small-town promise. She was an honor roll student at Heritage Hills High School, a cheerleader, a flute player in the marching band. Friends and family described her as a light, kind, driven, and full of life. She was the kind of person everyone believed was destined for great things far beyond the quiet borders of her hometown. In that same small community lived Roy Lee Ward. He was known, but not well known. A local man who, until that summer, was just another face in the fabric of the town. No one could have known that his path and Stacy's were on a collision course. For decades, investigators, lawyers, and the public would ask one question about Roy Lee Ward. Why? They would search his past for an answer, a reason for the darkness that was about to be unleashed. But the most crucial piece of that puzzle, a hidden truth about the very wiring of his brain, wouldn't surface for another 20 years. The story of what Roy Lee Ward did is a difficult one to tell. If you're just discovering this channel, consider subscribing. We believe these stories must be told with the respect and depth they deserve. July 11th, 2001. It was a hot, humid day in Dale, Indiana. Stacy Payne and her younger sister were home alone. The afternoon was quiet, uneventful, until there was a knock at the door. Standing on the porch was Roy Lee Ward. He had a simple, neighborly excuse. He was looking for a lost dog. It was a disarming, believable story in a town built on trust. Stacy let him in to use the phone. She didn't know it yet, but that small act of kindness was a fatal mistake. Stacy's younger sister was napping upstairs. She was woken by a scream, a sound so full of terror it didn't seem real. She crept from her room and peered down. The scene below was unthinkable. She saw a man on top of her sister. Her instincts took over. She didn't scream. She didn't run. She quietly picked up a phone, crept into a closet, and dialed 911. While the terrified girl whispered to the dispatcher, the attack downstairs continued. Ward, armed with a knife and a dumbbell he found inside the home, was committing an act of unspeakable brutality. The violence was swift, and it was total. Behind the closed door of the closet, time stood still. Every creak of the floorboards, every sound from downstairs was magnified. She didn't know if she would be next. Then she heard another sound, the sound of a car pulling up, brakes squealing. The Daletown marshal responding to the 911 call had arrived in minutes. He entered the home, his weapon drawn, expecting the unknown. What he found was a scene of pure horror. Roy Lee Ward was still inside the house, covered in blood, a knife in his hand. There was no fight, no attempt to flee. He was arrested at the scene, standing over the body of Stacy Payne. Stacy was still alive, but barely. She was airlifted to a nearby hospital, her body bearing the wounds of a savage attack, stab wounds, blunt force trauma, and injuries so severe they shocked even the most hardened medical professionals. Hours later, she succumbed to her injuries. The light that had shone so brightly in the small town of Dale had been extinguished. For investigators, this wasn't a whodunit. They had their man, caught red-handed, literally. The case against Roy Lee Ward seemed airtight. They had a confession, they had the murder weapons, they had an eyewitness who made the 911 call. The first trial in 2002 was swift. The evidence was overwhelming, and the community was both grieving and outraged. A jury found him guilty of murder, rape, and criminal deviant conduct, and sentenced him to death. For the Payne family, it seemed like the first step toward a painful but necessary sense of justice. But the legal system is a complex machine. The story was far from over. The Indiana Supreme Court reviewed the case and made a stunning decision. They ruled that the intense pre-trial media coverage in the small community had made a fair trial impossible. They overturned the conviction and the death sentence. For the Payne family, it was a devastating blow. The man who had confessed, who was caught at the scene, was being given another chance. The case was sent back to the lower courts, and the long road to justice had to be walked all over again. In 2007, facing a second trial, Roy Lee Ward changed his strategy. He pleaded guilty to the murder and rape of Stacy Payne. The fight was no longer about guilt or innocence, but about the price he would pay. A new jury was convened for the sentencing phase, and once again, after hearing the brutal details of the crime, they came to the same unanimous conclusion: death. This time, the sentence stuck. The Indiana execution process was now officially in motion, beginning a 17-year journey through the appeal system. The first conviction was overturned on a legal technicality. Facts. What do you think? Was this real justice at work or a painful delay for a grieving family? Drop your thoughts below. I'd love to know how you see it. Which brings us back to this morning, to the sterile, silent execution chamber. We began this story with a mystery, the unspoken final words of Roy Lee Ward. In the final hour before the execution, witnesses were assembled. The curtains were drawn. Ward was asked if he had any last words, and he simply shook his head and said, "Brian is going to read them." Brian was Deacon Brian Nosbush, his spiritual advisor, who was in the chamber with him. But when the warden asked the deacon to read the statement, protocol kicked in. He was not permitted to. So the execution proceeded in silence. The man at the center of it all, whose voice was the last thing Stacy Payne ever heard, chose not to use his own voice at the end. The reasons why, and the words he wrote, would only be revealed after his death. The payoff that everyone in that room was waiting for never came. It was an ending, but not a resolution. Just when the world thought it understood the case of Roy Lee Ward, a simple, brutal crime with a clear-cut perpetrator, a final detail emerged, years after his conviction. It was a detail that never made it to trial, something that recontextualized everything. In the course of his final appeals, Ward's attorneys had him evaluated by a clinical neuropsychologist. The result was a diagnosis that had been missed for his entire life: autism spectrum disorder. His lawyers argued that the diagnosis explained his flat emotional affect, his inability to communicate effectively, and his awkward social behavior, things that prosecutors in his original trials had likely framed as the cold, emotionless demeanor of a killer. This wasn't an excuse for the crime. It could never erase what he did. But it presented a haunting question. Could a man, neurologically incapable of processing and expressing emotion in a way society deems normal, ever truly show the kind of remorse everyone was looking for? This late discovery opened a rabbit hole of questions about the man on death row. Was his quietness in court a sign of cold-blooded guilt, or was it a symptom of a lifelong disability? The justice system had judged the man who committed the crime, but did it ever truly understand him? The final hours ticked away. Roy Lee Ward's request for his last meal was simple: 2 cheeseburgers, a pint of vanilla ice cream, and a soda. A final taste of a world he was about to leave. His attorneys fought to the very end, filing last-minute appeals questioning the temperature and storage of the lethal injection drug, pentobarbital, but each appeal was denied. Governor Mike Braun rejected his bid for clemency. There were no more roads to walk. As the execution began this morning, the process was clinical. The witnesses watched. At 12:33 a.m., it was over. The man who murdered Stacy Payne was gone. After the fact, his attorneys finally released the statement he had given to his spiritual advisor. In it, he expressed remorse. He wrote, "I hope that my death brings some peace to Stacy's family. I'm so sorry for the pain I caused." He thanked his own family for their love and support. For Stacy's family, the day was the end of a long and agonizing chapter, a measure of justice finally delivered. But for those who study the system, the case leaves behind a legacy of complex questions about media, justice, and the hidden truths we may never fully uncover. The story of Roy Lee Ward and Stacy Payne is one of Indiana's most haunting cases. If there's a case or inmate that you'd like me to investigate next, drop their name in the comments. Some of our most powerful stories have come straight from you. In the end, no one truly walked away from the events of July 11th, 2001. A family was shattered, a community's sense of security was broken, and a man's life ended this morning in a quiet room, leaving behind only echoes and questions. Was this justice, or just the illusion of it? Every story on death row carries 2 tragedies, the one that took a life and the one that will soon end. If you believe every story deserves to be told, subscribe and help us uncover the next.